Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we're going to hear from Bec Wonders and about lesser known radical feminist pamphlets and articles from 1970 to 1980. And I'm going to stop sharing. So welcome, Bec. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to get me on just for the moment. So Bec Wonders is a Dr. Bec Wonders. She's got a PhD in early feminist periodicals in the UK. And she's going to talk to us about those early feminist periodicals for 30 to 40 minutes. And then there'll be a chance to have questions, put questions for Bec. In the Q&A is probably the best place, but if you put them in the chat, I'll try to look at them, and I'll come back on and talk to Bec at the end for about 20 minutes. So thank you so much, Bec, and we're really pleased to have you, and thank you everybody who's come. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks for inviting me to talk today. It was really sort of serendipitous running into you a couple of weeks ago, and Joe just asked me, do I want to do this? And of course I do. So thanks so much for tuning in. I'm going to begin by explaining some of my thinking and the way I approach these documents. So firstly, I think that there can be a tendency to romanticize feminist histories and the women's liberation movement in particular, because we often categorize really complex social dynamics and messy hierarchies and conflicts into these neat and tidy boxes. So when we think of previous movements, it's easy to evoke images that are based on, popularized stories, which have been mediated again and again and again through male-controlled media, and leave us today with more superficial and vague associations of our histories, and I also think create unrealistic expectations for other women today. So I'm specifically interested in looking at primary source material, specifically of the women's liberation movement, firstly, because women were producing unparalleled vast amounts of publications themselves as part of the women in print philosophy, which entailed taking control over the means of production of how women communicate with each other. And secondly, because I feel as though every time I look at primary source material, I'm in direct conversation with feminists of that time. And I would almost describe it as an intergenerational relationship with women who are featured in these records. So many of these records allow young women today to really grasp how complicated and difficult previous feminist movements have been, because these records were by and large distributed only among women's liberation activists. The audience, the readership was very specific to the women's liberation movement. So they're as close as we can get, besides maybe meeting minutes or audio recordings, to unfiltered accounts of women thinking through their disagreements and arguments. And my research, as Joe said, is primarily focused on feminist periodicals. So that's magazines, journals, and newsletters of this period. But today, I'm hoping to talk through a few examples of pamphlets. Now, there's no real clear distinction of what makes something a pamphlet and a periodical. These things overlap. I suppose the main difference you could speculate is that pamphlets are typically one-off or two-off publications that maybe more closely resemble the process of book publishing, because periodicals require this sort of serialized and repetitive effort. But yeah, like I said, many of these records could have attributes of multiple genres of print media. So I'm using the category of pamphlet very loosely. I'm also going to be focusing on United States, material from the United States primarily. This is because I'm kind of taking you through a little bit of a story, although my most of my knowledge is based on British feminist material, but today we're going to look at United States stuff. And I think that one of the most interesting things for me is to be able to trace some of these early formulations and workings out of feminist theory through these women-controlled material print media, and to be able to see sort of in real time how these ideas spread and changed and evolved by bringing various arguments into conversation with other women through the material infrastructure of the feminist print network. And that's the position I'm starting from. So I've already told the co-hosts today that maybe the title is a little bit misleading because lesser known pamphlets really depends on your existing knowledge and age and experience. So perhaps what I'm presenting today is the more well-known of the lesser known records. Now I'm going to start sharing my screen with the images. It might be a bit pixelated. You might not be able to read the actual text on it. It doesn't matter too much because I'm going to talk through what's on there, but it's just to give you a kind of visual, a little taste. So it's not just me talking. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Okay. Let me know if there's any issues. So what you see here is a cover of a document called Notes from the First Year. This was published in 1968 by a group called New York Radical Women. This group was in existence between 1967 and 1969, so only 2 years. It was founded by Robin Morgan, who you're going to speak to, I think, next week about her new book. So it was founded by Robin Morgan, Carol Hainish, Shulamith Firestone, and Pam Allen. And it also had many other members that you might recognize the names of. These were primarily women who branched out from the male-dominated New Left and anti-war movements. And they're perhaps best known for protesting the 1968 Miss America pageant. And that sort of whole myth about bra burners started there. And that's an interesting kind of conversation to have, whether that really happened and so on. You may recognize here, if you can manage to read some of the text, you may recognize Shulamith Firestone's name, who was one of the founders and wrote The Dialectic of Sex in 1970, so 2 years after this was published. You also may recognize The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm by Anne Cote, which was published as a full text in 1970, again, 2 years after this. So we can see here at the beginning, and I'm going to repeat myself on this point, but we can see here the beginning of women sort of starting to work out their ideas through this form. Okay, so we're going to move on to Notes from the Second Year. Now, this was published because Notes from the First Year was so popular. It was published 2 years after Notes from the First Year in 1970. Here you may recognize in the table of contents, you may recognize The Politics of Housework by Pat Minardi. You may recognize again The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm by Anne Cote, so another installation of her writing. You also may recognize at the top The Bitch Manifesto by Joreen, or she also goes by Jo Freeman, which is considered an early example of language reclamation, so taking words back in a social justice movement, and it's also a criticism of enforced gender roles. Now, one of the perhaps best, most well-known contributions to this issue is The Personal is Political. Oh, hang on, sorry. I did this when I was practicing as well. So here we go. The Politics of Housework. Here you can see it a bit better. The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm, and then we've got The Bitch Manifesto. There we go. So as I said, perhaps the most well-known contributions is The Personal is Political by Carol Hainish. A lot of people credit this article with the origins of the phrase "the personal is political," but Carol Hainish herself says that it was actually Shulamith Firestone and Anne Cote who came up with the title for a possible paper in an earlier collection of writing. However, this is definitely the sort of publication, the iteration which popularized the term. Put in simple terms, this article is a critique of what she calls therapy culture, where it's assumed that the solution to women's troubles is personal. And instead, Hainish argues that we all need basically political therapy in the sense that personal problems are political problems and must be addressed by changing objective and political conditions of society, not just by adjusting oneself. Okay, then in this edition, we've also got Sexual Politics by Kate Millett. So this was first written in 1968 for a women's liberation group at Columbia University. And it's worth looking up the history of how she was promised certain platforms and radio stations to present this at, and then was rejected as soon as they actually saw what she was writing about, and how that kind of had the opposite effect, where because it was, what we would call today maybe canceled or censored, women took more of an interest in this material, and it ended up being one of the biggest women's liberation groups at one point at Columbia University. So anyways, this was then developed into the 1970 book Sexual Politics, which you all know very well. And essentially in this article, she describes how sexual politics socialize both men and women into these patriarchal policies. And she also lays out the conditions for sexual revolution. Okay. Next up in this issue, we also have the organizing principles of the New York radical feminists. This is really interesting to me because it's a really intimate insight into the structural workings of the group, and we don't often get to see, internal policies of the group. They place a lot of emphasis, if you see here on the second page, they place a lot of emphasis on small group working, which I will get back to shortly. But in particularly, I noticed it's on the second page under structure. It's the second paragraph. Again, you don't need to read it, but I'm just pointing out where I'm looking. They specify here that, quote, nuclear leaderless / structureless groups of no more than 15, together with some minimal coordination between them, have proven to be the organizational method best suited to our needs and goals. So they're basically saying small group and structureless, non-hierarchical is the best way we work. Now, this is interesting to me because in the third installation, this would also be the final installation. So this is kind of why I'm considering it a pamphlet and not necessarily a periodical, although again, these categories are, mutable. In this installation, notes from the third year, Jo Freeman, or Joreen, who, if you remember, wrote the Bitch Manifesto, submitted her article, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Now, the tyranny of structurelessness is an analysis of power relations in radical feminist collectives. Here, she argues that this aspirational goal of non-hierarchical working can often lead to unspoken and unaccountable hierarchies because a lack of structure can disguise underlying power relations between women. This text is also available for free on her website, I think. Now, it was not published in Notes from the Third Year, and instead ended up being officially published in the periodical The Second Wave in 1972. Now, it strikes me as strange that this was not published in Notes from the Third Year, because this is the editorial of that issue. And here you can see that they're quite open about the fact that clearly there's some shifts in thinking about working practices and strategy. Here they say, a euphoric period of consciousness raising has come to an end, and a more sober evaluation has replaced it. Women are beginning to see that consciousness raising is meant as a stage of growth, not the ultimate stage of growth. It is limited as a tool. They go on to say, in moving from the small amorphous rap group towards a more outward directed group, the problem of structure arises. The women's movement will need to work out for itself a satisfactory form which can avoid the typical pitfalls of authoritarian leadership or inflexible ideology, which so many other movements have experienced. So here we can see that they're thinking about structureless organizing and the potential pitfalls, as they say. And so that's why I think it's strange that they didn't publish it. Perhaps women in the chat know why. It could be anything from maybe the text wasn't ready to maybe it wasn't saying what they wanted it to say. But before we move on, some other contributions in this issue that you may recognize are Susan Brownmiller speaking out on prostitution. We've got Mary Daly, The Spiritual Dimensions of Women's Liberation. And we've also got The Woman Identified Woman by Radical Lesbians. Now, this is a really, really interesting essay that was published or distributed at a now conference. I think a year or 2 years earlier than this. I actually unpack the whole story of this in my PhD. And it's worth looking up and reading as a statement, because it really, I think, is one of the earliest examples of the articulation of political lesbianism, and that's quite interesting. So this would also be the last installment of Notes From. As there existed underlying tensions between the socialist-leaning feminists and the radical feminist members, and eventually the New York Radical Women group disintegrated and other groups emerged out of that, and we'll get back to that shortly. But first, I'd like to bring your attention to another article in Notes from the Third Year, which is Free Space by Pamela Allen. So this was a reprint of a previously published pamphlet under the same name called Free Space, A Perspective on the Small Group in Women's Liberation. It was also later reprinted in the 1973 anthology Radical Feminism, which is edited by Ann Coate, Ellen Levine, and Anita Rapone. So if you have this book, you can read a short version of this text. And this book I've seen on quite a few second-hand websites and so on. So it's perhaps more accessible than the actual pamphlet. But the original pamphlet was written after Allen had left New York, and she left the New York Radical Women and joined a consciousness-raising group in San Francisco called Sitzefloppen. Sitzefloppen began as a group of women who would regularly meet in the feminist bookstore Old Wives' Tales in 1969. And fun fact, the name Sitzefloppen was intended to be nonsensical because they wanted to be defined by their ideas and their work rather than just a descriptive group title. I quite like that. The women met regularly as a small group and began speaking about the role of women in society, their attitudes towards themselves and other women, the very real problems with men in their private lives and in their jobs, and what they hoped the group could be. And during this process, Allen wrote this pamphlet as a handbook for the small group process. And I'm going to briefly go through some of the things she says, because it's quite good. They're quite good guidelines, I should say, useful to adopt. One of the central contributions is the idea of free space. She argues that if women only associate with family or close friends, we will not be challenged to develop new facets of ourselves. So instead, she argues that we must encounter other women with whom we don't associate with regularly in order to develop ourselves more fully as human beings. She calls this meeting ground free space, where our perspectives and our consciousness about ourselves and others can be expanded and challenged. One of the requisites, however, for free space is mutual trust between women, which is necessary for honesty. And she talks about how difficult it is to build trust between women because usually women are afraid or they don't like another woman's personality or her ideas. And so it's quite difficult to build trust, of course. But she says that one method of building trust is simply by living up to the commitments we make. So if we commit ourselves to a group and say, we'll cook dinner for the group during our meetings, or we'll prepare the agenda or whatever, we build trust by demonstrating that we fulfill and live up to our commitments to other women. Now, women should also consider, she says that women should also consider closing their groups after a certain amount of time, or only letting in new members who have had experience in similar groups, because continuity and mutual understanding takes time and effort to accumulate. And it's really hard for a new woman to join when existing women already have relationships. And there's a power dynamic involved in that as well. So having established the environment of free space, she then moves on to describe the small group process, which is a version of early methods of consciousness raising. Interestingly, she writes here that we are a group which believes that there is always a structure, The issue is to consciously choose one that will encourage our growth rather than just hope that it will happen. So this kind of indicates that thinking similar to Joreen's article about the tyranny of structurelessness was being implemented here on a practical level, and women were kind of thinking about similar things and working out their thoughts and practices. Um, okay, so there are four main components to this small group process. The first one is opening up. This refers to an individual need for women to open up and talk about our feelings, ourselves, and our lives. It's important not to categorize these feelings as good or bad, but simply to acknowledge their existence. Opening up is also an important part of the early stages of any small group, during which intimacy and trust can be fostered between women. And she calls this the honeymoon period of the small group, when women break their feelings of isolation and realize and connect with others who have similar feelings and experiences. Now, one caveat is that it gets harder to open up as time gets on, because you may have negative feelings about other women in the group. But Pamela Allen says that such disclosures are necessary if trust and sisterhood are to become long-term reality, so sustainable trust, which is the messy bit, I suppose. And the second component is sharing. So opening it up, which is the first component, can easily veer into the self-indulgence territory, perhaps. So this is why it's important to create a space in which other women are able to respond to whoever is opening up and share their own experiences. And the intention here, she says, is to arrive at an understanding of the social conditions of women by pooling descriptions of the forms of oppressions have taken in each individual's lives. This leads us to the realization that often our experiences are not personal at all, but instead are rooted in broader social and political structures. And I feel like this is kind of the most well-known component of consciousness raising, which helps us identify the cause of the problem in a broader context, right? Not just a personal one. So the third component you can see here on the bottom right is analyzing. This uses the basic raw data from the opening up and sharing processes, and then tries to define the whys and hows, as well as possible solutions. This is it's really important that this happens after opening up and sharing, because then the analysis will be based on the female understanding of the reality of women's oppression, rather than anyone else's experience. So it's really important that this happens as the third stage. It's a process of going beyond the personal experience and allowing women to function intellectually as thinkers. And this is a period also during which we think larger and broader about how our experiences make sense in the broader context of how the entire society functions. Okay, so finally, we've got number 4, which is abstracting. This is the final step and involves creating some distance between us and our concerns in order to conceive of our potential outside of oppressive systems. She says, when we remove ourselves from immediate necessity, we are able to take the concepts and analysis we have developed and discuss abstract theory. And she describes this process as the purest form of free space. Now, one final paragraph she includes in her thoughts about the small group process, which I find really useful, is this. She says, if we are to become autonomous thinkers, each individual must work out her own framework for herself. The goal of the group should not be to force each member into one mold. Differences should be explored, alternative perspectives encouraged, for our goal is autonomous women, not women dependent on a group for ideology. This means that each individual must do her own work and thinking. Although there may seem to be many differences within a group, I think that a lot of these will prove to be individual perspectives of the same reality. Now, there's many other nuggets in this pamphlet that I won't go through today, but I would like to do a more in-depth reading of several consciousness-raising papers and group guidelines. So do let me know if that's something you're interested in. All right, so we're moving on to sisterhood is powerful. Now, this definitely doesn't fit the criteria of lesser known, but there's a method to my madness. So it's put together by Robin Morgan, um, and the published in 1970, excuse me. And the anthology includes quite a few articles which were originally published in notes from the first, second, and third year. So it includes Sexual Politics by Kate Millett, The Politics of Housework by Pat Mainardi, The Organizing Principles of the New York Radical Women, and more. But I would like us to take a look at a specific article, namely Institutionalized Oppression versus the Female by Florence Kennedy. So this article touches on differences and difficulty internal to the women's movement, which is my segue here from the Pamela Allen guidelines on working through differences within a small group. Okay, it all makes sense. Florence Kennedy was a lawyer, a radical feminist, a civil rights activist, and lecturer. She also founded the Feminist Party, which eventually nominated Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm for president in 1972. Shirley Chisholm was also the first Black woman elected to the United States Congress. Now, this article is one of the first early articulations of conflict within the women's liberation movement. She defines the concept here of horizontal hostility. And she says that this is a necessary component of the circularity of oppression in an institutionalized system. And she argues that those who are oppressed know only two states of being, either somebody's foot on their neck or their foot on somebody else's neck, which is why when oppressed people rise the social ladder, they can inadvertently take on the role of the oppressor. Now, horizontal hostility differs from vertical hostility, in the sense that the vertical direction is aimed at institutions such as the media, the legal system, or the church, whereas horizontal direction refers to other marginalized counterparts, so your peers. Okay, so while Kennedy does not blame women for our own subordination, she does make a case for how oppression is not simply violently enforced, but that the social order requires a certain degree of complicity by women to be successful. All right. Now, the concept of horizontal hostility was so well known. Brace yourselves here for this cover because it's quite something. It was so well known that during the women's liberation movement, it even appeared as a satirical feature in the 1976 collection Titters, the first collection of humor by women. So yes, this is a satirical collection. It's quite big. I've got a copy right here. And it's got comics and sort of, yeah, satirical stories and recipes and things like that. Now, in this excerpt on horizontal hostility, it says here, attend the first annual conference to divide women. And a bit further down, it says personality workshop. This workshop will teach new techniques for smashing the male concept of personality. Learn to rid yourself of those quirks, those idiosyncrasies that make you different from other women. The horizontal hostility workshop will introduce a new ritual developed in Boston, which involves the blood sacrifice of one member of the group per hour. This technique does wonders to ease tensions and allows for a constant flow of new members in the group. Okay, so again here, I mean, it is silly, but we can trace how ideas and concepts moved from one publication to another. And in doing so, we can make sense of these complicated and overlooked concerns in the women's liberation movement and how they traveled through the vehicle of women-controlled print media, okay? So we'll move on now to something a little bit more serious, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your disposition. We've got here The Power and Helplessness in the Women's Movement by Joanna Russ, published in 1982. We're going to go back to the 70s in a minute, but first we'll take a look at this. If Joanna Russ sounds familiar to you, it's because she's also the author of How to Suppress Women's Writing, and also the famous science fiction novel, The Female Man. In this article here, however, she reflects on some of the internal struggles facing feminists. So she argues that women, especially feminists, are also those who judge and control each other most harshly. And within the patriarchal framework, she argues that there are two possible roles for women to occupy. Either a woman is a magic mama or a trembling sister. Now, while a magic mama renounces her own needs, feels guilt over her own achievements, and is expected to have infinite time and energy for others, the trembling sister is allowed to express her own desires and needs at the cost of enforced helplessness, which requires that somebody else fill her needs for her, usually the magic mama, right? And so neither the magic mama or the trembling sister are liberated, and both resent each other. Joanna Russ calls this dynamic the feminine imperative. And it's when women are required to make each other feel good all the time, setting honesty aside and putting a premium on hurt feelings, which leads to a general fear and paralysis and eventual disintegration of the group as a whole. So this is interesting because obviously, it talks about the inability of women to be honest with each other and making each other feel good all the time. Now, the flip side of that is also perhaps undesirable, where avoiding this is an excuse to just, be mean and cruel, and nobody wants that either. So now we're going to travel back a few years, back to 1976, and we're going to look at a booklet called Constructive Criticism. Okay, so I wouldn't attribute this necessarily to the legacy of second wave feminist publishing, but I think it's incredibly relevant for understanding conflict and disagreement internal to any social movement, and especially in this case, the women's liberation movement. So this was published by Gracie Lyons, or written, I should say, by Gracie Lyons. It was a small press bestseller aimed at providing tools for honest and productive disagreement based on the premise that criticism is necessary for any political movement to enact fundamental change. So one of the great quotes that she says is, "The first mistake is to emphasize unity at all costs. People who fall into this position fail to make a correct distinction between allies and enemies, or between working class and ruling class ideology. As a result, they seek to smooth over differences. This position often springs from the fear that someone might feel bad if a struggle goes on, or from an opportunist desire to maintain a vague, unprincipled alliance. In either case, the fear of struggle usually boils down to the fear that things will be messy for me if the struggle gets hot. This kind of liberalism arises from narrow self-interest, from thinking about what is good for oneself or a small group, and not about what is good for the whole movement." And yeah, so I just said, it's, you don't want the flip side either of, being cruel or mean. And so it's very useful, this handbook, because she provides us with several guidelines divided into how to do criticism and how to receive criticism. So these are very practical, and I think they're ripe for adopting, to the contemporary context. I don't think ever that we should take things too literally and be too dogmatic about being purist about these things. But it's a really, really good starting off point. If you like, I can go through these guidelines later. There's also a lecture on my website. If you go to beckwonders.com under workshops, which explains each guideline in detail. Also, if you search for Constructive Criticism by Gracie Lyons, there's several places online where the text has been made available for free. Okay, so speaking of groups disintegrating and feminist conflict, we'll now take a look at one of my last examples, which is Feminist Revolution by the Red Stockings Collective. This was published in 1978. But back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the New York radical women group disintegrated, its radical feminist leaning members, so that includes Shulamith Firestone and Ellen Willis, founded a new group called Red Stockings. Though it went through many iterations and reformations, and members left and new members joined, but that's kind of the original formation. This group participated in street theater protests, consciousness raising, and also produced collections of writing. The most famous example is the Feminist Revolution collection. published by Random House in 1978. It includes articles by Kathy Sarachild, Carol Hainish, and Barbara Leon, and more. There's even an entire section here on the liberal takeover of women's liberation, which I think could be a good starting off point when we ask the question today of how did we get here? We got to backtrack, basically. Controversially, and this is perhaps the most well-known story about this publication, the publisher Random House decided not to include an expose on Gloria Steinem's early work with the CIA. Red Stocking's coverage of this issue began with this 1975 press release in which they challenged Gloria Steinem's political credibility as well as that of the magazine she founded, Ms. Magazine. Yes, and women in the chat, I'm sure will know way more about this than I do. It's quite hard, I find, to find a sort of detailed information about what happened when with this. Yeah, this is sort of where I'm ending it, I suppose. I really don't have a snappy conclusion, but what I can do is walk you through some of the pamphlets I have got here. So we've got Free Space, get a sense of the size as well and the thickness. So it's a really small pamphlet, this. Then we've got Constructive Criticism. Okay, again, small. This was part of a series as well called Issues in Radical Therapy. So there's several other sort of publications that were part of this. Then we've got Titters, I already showed you that. We've also got Feminist Revolution, again, a bit larger, thicker. I still find this, I still keep coming back to this and just finding really interesting things to read. I think it's one of the greatest collections really ever published, in my personal opinion. Not necessarily because I agree with everything, but again, my interest in these records is to really look at, where some of these ideas started and to connect with women in these pages and to feel like, I'm in conversation with them. Then we've got one that I didn't show. So this is a Canadian publication called Stepping Out of Line, a workbook on lesbianism and feminism by Nim Hughes, Yvonne Johnson, and Yvette Perriot. Now, this was published in Vancouver by Press Gang, which was a Canadian feminist print collective. And these, again, are practical guidelines based on working with lesbians. So it goes through a workshop script, it gives you, again, frameworks and theory and talking points and things like that. I find this, again, really helpful. And in a way, again, by implementing these things and reading these things today, we create this intergenerational lineage, intergenerational connections by not letting these things just sit in a box and fester in the past. We've also got, I thought since I mentioned Titters and since I mentioned the humor collection, I would also mention Sour Cream. I've only got one issue of this. This is a feminist comic strip. And there were multiple publications of these. And this was published by Sheba Feminist Press, which is actually British, in London. Okay, we've also got here Ripening, an almanac of lesbian lore and vision. There were 4, I think, women can correct me, but there were 4 editions of this, one for each season. I find this a really beautiful collection. It's got lots of illustrations in it, lots of poetry, lots of musings, very much about, I think this is the autumn season or early winter, that's right. So it's got lots of, tips and musings about the seasons changing and women. And this was published by Iowa City Women's Press in 1981 and written by Lee Lanning and Vernette Hart. There we go. All right, we've also got a reprint of consciousness raising guidelines. Now, the more, so this was reprinted in 2017, but the original guidelines are from 1975 from a publication called A Practical Guide to the Women's Movement that was written by Women's Action Alliance. Now, this is a reprint of their consciousness raising guidelines. And this is published by Half Letter Press It also includes guidelines specifically for Black women. And you can purchase this online. So if you search for Half Letter Press, trying to make the personal political, you should be able to find it. Okay, we've got another reprint. This is called Black Women Organizing, the Brixton Black Women's Group and the Organization for Women of African and Asian Descent. This is another reprint. This is by Past Tense, is the publisher. So you can, again, buy this online. This was also published in 2017. And these are organizing guidelines for the organizations mentioned. And also on the cover here is Olive Morris, was a very famous feminist in Brixton. She's the co-founder of these organizations, a squatter, a civil rights activist, really, really inspiring woman. So this is also worth purchasing if you're interested. Then we've got Hens in the Hay. Now, this was published by a Scottish feminist press, Stramulian, I believe in 1980. Yes, that's right. And I'm just seeing here, this is really interesting. So some of the poems first appeared in the Only Women Press anthology, One Foot on the Mountain, and another poem first appeared in Spare Rib. So again, we see how a lot of these ideas started in more ephemeral, cheap publications, and then ended up being published and finessed, okay? And yeah, a collection of Scottish feminist poetry by a feminist press. Now, this is Complaints and Disorders, The Sexual Politics of Sickness by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English. The more well-known book that they did, or pamphlet that they did, is, of course, Witches, Midwives, and Nurses. I don't have a copy of that, so I'm showing you this instead. This, I believe, is a reprint as well. Or it's just in really good condition. No, I think it's just in really good condition. Feels like a reprint, but no, this is from 1973. I think that many of these texts also can be found online, so just give it a search. And we've got an interesting one here. So this is called To Fear Jane Alpert is to Fear Ourselves and Other Letters. Now, Jane Alpert was an American former far-left radical who conspired in the bombings of 8 government and commercial office buildings in 1969. And she went on the run, basically, and during that time was drawn to radical feminism and had criticisms of the left, and wrote letters to Ms. Magazine. And this is a collection of letters that it's both her letter that she wrote and also replies that she got. So really interesting. I think I'd like to do a bit more research on this. And finally, I'd like to show you just a version of Women's Yellow Pages. So there's tons of these. There's Toronto Women's Yellow Pages, San Francisco Women's Yellow Pages. I mean, I guess primarily in the US, I don't think I've really seen UK version. I'd say the closest thing that comes to a directory in Britain is maybe WIRES, Women's Informational Referral and Inquiry Service. But Yellow Pages, I suppose, is a North American thing, isn't it? So that makes sense. And yeah, it's just a directory of, you know, women's businesses and groups and things like that, and contributing to the network of women's knowledge, women's communication, women's relationships with each other. So like I said, I don't really have a snappy conclusion. There's no really point that I want to make besides conveying the way in which print media allowed for women to communicate, spread, and think through ideas as a networked movement, okay? It wasn't just networked through, you know, sheer will alone. There's a material infrastructure to the women's liberation movement. And it's just always such a joy to go through these records because I feel, like I said, as though I'm thinking through these issues with the women at the time. And I always find it a really important exercise for avoiding the oversimplification and flattening of feminist histories. Because as you can see, women were thinking through lots of complicated issues and things were not easy. Neither are they now because, you know, women, we're all different. We always will be different and there always will be conflict and disagreement. And I find that the power of print media, feminist print media, is really creating a space for that, to allow that to exist in a practical way. So I'll end it there. And I don't know, Joe, if you want to hop in, we've got 15 minutes left. So maybe
Yeah.
there's some questions or comments.
So thank you so much, Bec. That was totally inspiring and really interesting. And I just didn't realize that anybody had done this. So it's just amazing that you have. So there are some questions in the Q&A. There are 4 questions that you might be able to have a look at, but I'm gonna sort of say a couple of things while you're looking at them. Is one, you mentioned a couple of times that you would there's a possibility of doing more in-depth reading on some of the pamphlets and some of the issues, and there's lots more material, I guess, that you know about. And yes, please. So please do come on Radical Feminist Perspectives again. We run this every Sunday morning, and then we publish it on YouTube. So a lot of the people watching will be watching on YouTube, and we've put it up on a couple of other platforms as well. And in response to some of the questions women have been asking, is some of the pamphlets, where can you get them? And
Yes.
we're going to put the links. So there's actually been people putting some of the links to anything that is available or that we know is available. We'll put that all under in the comments in the YouTube video, and Bec Wonders .com.
Yes.
We'll put the link to that. So anybody who wants those, and then it is possible if Bec sends more to me, we'll put that up. Then I have a question, the first question, and then we can do the other ones. So, do you think this was the heyday, this 1970s and a bit of the 80s? Has anything like this happened before or afterwards, or was this the best moment for these pamphlets?
I mean, it certainly is the most saturated moment, right? Like when I was doing my PhD, especially, there had to be a point where I was like, oh, okay, I can't actually talk about everything because there was just so much, and it's such a rich legacy to leave behind to young women and other generations, and was, part of this really conscious effort to take control over the means of communication. That was certainly unique, I think, to the 70s and 80s, but women in publishing and feminist print material has always been tied to any kind of emergence of women's political movements, because of course you have to get your ideas out there, right? And you have to communicate with other women. So there's a really rich burgeoning field of feminist first wave and suffragette feminist periodicals. I don't know nearly enough about them, but Professor Sarah Peterson has written a book on Mumsnet, and she has, so that's maybe how you know her, and she's a real expert in that field. But yeah, so I suppose that it was unique in the sense of the amount of material, but I wouldn't consider it necessarily the best or unique, because every time there's an uprising of women, we're going to see more material being put out, more essays and articles being written, more communication, just because that is the movement. And often it's really hard to define, the second wave by any kind of ideology or idea, because like I said, women disagreed on so much, and that's also what my PhD is about. All these things women disagreed about: anti-Semitism, political lesbianism, socialist feminism. So you can't really say, oh, second wave feminism is when women thought this, because women thought a million different things. But what I think is really characteristic of the second wave is the women in print medium. So the output of material and feminist publishing is how I think about the second wave, is control over the means of production. That is really unique about that time. And I just want to say as well, sorry, about the question of where can we get copies and so on. So I have created a sort of archive over lockdown, and it doesn't contain, it sometimes contains the PDFs if they've been made available for free before, but usually it's mostly just a bibliographical website. So it has all the titles of second wave feminist books and pamphlets. It's got images, it's got the table of contents. Sometimes it doesn't have the actual PDF. However, I also have under the FAQs a section where there's some secondhand book websites that you can go and search. I'll put it in the comments now. It's a German word. It's called Frauenkultur, which means women's culture. I grew up in Germany. It's not just totally random. This is an archive where you can kind of explore a few more titles. I search online a lot. A lot of it is expensive, unfortunately. But yeah, it also helps just, knowing older women, being friends with older women, and being a depository of these things. So yeah, I hope to share as much as I can through my website and the archive. Yeah, Joe, go on.
So I have a question sort of related to what we've been saying is, what do you think now? Because you're saying that the sort of characterization of the second wave maybe would be the pamphlets and the writing and the ownership or taking control of the means of communication. What wave are we in? Are we in a wave now? And also what's happening now with this video internet age? What are your thoughts on that?
I believe it's an essay in 1980 that first coined the third wave. And in many ways, some people think that it has to do with the rise of identity politics. So, defining oneself based on one's characteristics and doing politics that way. I don't know. The wave question is really tricky. I think we could do like a whole conversation on that. But in terms of sort of digital age, social media, I saw a few questions on that. Well, yesterday you did an amazing discussion on Spinster, the feminist social network. So we can see some efforts sort of similar to the second wave in using today's technology and media, but kind of appropriating the similar sort of philosophy of taking control. Now, it's not as easy, I don't think, just because of how these platforms have really, infected most of our lives. And the reach is problematic as well. But and also these platforms are really designed to not to have good faith arguments. So because of the character limits, because of the instantaneous nature in which you respond to something, you don't have adequate time to really reflect and consider the other point of view. And that's really what these platforms thrive on, and how content becomes more engaging. So for instance, during the 70s and 80s, women would maybe read something in a periodical, take time to read it. Also, women would of course read it in connection with the rest of the content in that material, right? So they wouldn't just read one thing, they would read that thing and then maybe an article on what's happening in Ghana with women, or in India with women, or something about women's workers' rights, right? So women would, I would argue, have a much better understanding of common theoretical problems, whereas the way in which social media algorithms work is so personalized to you that what you know is a completely different starting off point than to what another woman knows. And so it's much more difficult to engage in good faith arguments, and also simply the time, right, to like write the letter by hand or by typewriter, send it off, have another woman think about it and decide and select it, put it in the magazine, and then be read again. So it's slow communication rather than quick and fast and reactionary communication. And that is something I think that's really going to be really difficult to try and sway away from. And I don't have the solution. I don't have the solution. But yeah, there's a really good, again, academic anthology, which if you can ask your local library to order it, it's worth it. It's by Jessica McGarry. And it's called, hang on, it's about social media feminism. And she kind of compares it to second wave print culture. It's called The Limitations of Social Media Feminism, No Space of Our Own, right? And she also argues, of course, that, you know, men control these platforms, men control the policies, men are making a lot of money, and it's all in, most of it happens, unless you have a closed group, most of it happens out in the open. And that's another thing that second wave print culture was able to do, is really, you know, a lot of these magazines would say, you know, for women only, or for lesbians only, or for Black women only, or for Black working class women only, right? So they would specify their audience and have this really internal conversation, which is how kind of theory can emerge. Again, you have to have this trust. And because so many of these conversations are happening out in the open, you know, at the board table with the oppressor, so to say, you have a completely different dynamic. So those are some of my thoughts. Again, I'm open to, you know, other points of view, and I don't have the answer, but yeah, I've been rambling for a bit.
And so I'm going to read out one of the questions is from Dorothea Anderson. Any ideas on how we can use these principles of organization in an age of social media? So it's sort of coming back to a bit what you've just said.
Yeah, so I think Spinster is a really great initiative. Again, I would like us to think about slow communication, and also just really prioritizing relationships with women outside of social media. I'm not someone who says delete your social media account at all, because, you know, there's a practicality involved to that, and there's also benefits. It's not all bad, but I would say prioritize, you know, women in your life outside of social media, and think about slow communication, and also, you know, taking time to think through ideas together, and creating, you know, perhaps making an initiative to create that kind of space. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a magic recipe.
That's really, really good. I've got a question. What are you doing now? What are you working on now you've finished your PhD?
At the moment, I'm unemployed and living in London, and yeah, looking for, kind of trying to figure out what I want to do. So I don't have an answer to that either, unfortunately, but continuing to do, you know, feminist research is the goal. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an incredibly good resource for women who are writing about the second wave or writing about the feminism in the 80s, 70s. This video you've made, and then a lot of the attendees are very linked in. So hopefully someone will offer you a job as a researcher.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So now let's see. What I suppose what I would say a question is, well, there's a question from Marie Long. Where did you get these pamphlets? And I think you might have told us before, but if you could explain to women how to find these.
Yeah, a lot of it, I spend a lot of time online, looking through used book websites. Again, like I said, a lot of the more well-known, lesser-known stuff is quite expensive. But yeah, I sometimes I just see something cheap and kind of chance it, if it's got a good title, and just see what happens when it arrives. Also, there's sometimes library sales, or sometimes archives will be wanting to get rid of duplicates. So I'm always asking archives if they have duplicates. And just being a receptacle for these documents from older women that I know. So that's always the most special way to acquire these things, is through personal collection. But yeah, it's a combination of online, archive, and duplicates. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Bec. We've come to the end of our time. We're going to put this up on YouTube so women will be able to watch it. We will definitely invite Bec back regularly. And if you want to send an email to her, there's her website, but you can send it to info@womensdeclaration.com. We'll forward it on. I for one would pay to come and listen to you, Bec. So I think if you were to set up a sort of women's studies class, I will promote it widely and come. And then just the final thing is that we're so lucky that it was an in-life encounter, that's a real life
Yeah.
encounter, that both Bec and I went to the launch of Deep Deception by Helen Steele and others about the spy cops issue, which we're hoping, hopefully we'll be able to cover on a webinar soon. So came across Bec, who I've had a fantastic conversation with, I think at Bradford Filia,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe two Filias with it. So those are all three times I've met Bec have been, or at least two times I've met you, have been in real life. And which, so it really does sort of show that it's wonderful. It's been great for everybody here, and a real privilege for you to speak to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, women. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. So there's a breakout room for attendees, and see you next week. We've got another webinar next week. It's about Emma Goldman. So see you next week. Okay, bye.